to 911. Where's your emergency?
Hi, yes, my fiance just overdosed. There is a gentleman passed out on the
Heroin
second floor.
is so addictive.
And he passed out in their room.
So dangerous.
What did he take?
So deadly.
It's heroin.
It has become one of the worst drug epidemics in Virginia history.
How old is the patient?
Heroin doesn't care what background you have or where you came from.
34, 35. I don't think he's breathing.
Heroin doesn't care what your skin color is, how smart you are.
He took what?
How old you are, whether you're male or female.
Heroin and Xanax.
Now I approach this moment, this coldness takes over, takes control, the coping is dormant.
Heroin overdose deaths in Virginia nearly doubled from 2011 to 2013.
The answer is no. Know what the answer is? No, that this demon's
Every region has experienced an increase in heroin fatalities,
the sickness is too much for me to handle. My stomach is doing flips.
including a 164% increase in Northern Virginia, a 94% increase in Hampton Roads, and a 50% increase in the Richmond metro area. Jamal Davis is a homicide detective with the Norfolk Police. His background in narcotics investigation showed him a lot about the dangers of drugs, but heroin comes across his desk more than ever in death investigations.
When I first started back 16 years ago in narcotics, it was mainly cocaine and crack.
Actually, let me come listen to some of that.
But today's heroin user is often quite different from the addict of years past.
Just play one of them.
Far from street-smart junkie stereotypes, users are likely to come to heroin on a much more innocent path, one that begins in a doctor's office, where strong medications called opiates are prescribed to relieve pain after a surgery or injury.
You get clean, and now you're finding out.
Dr. James Thompson is a board-certified addiction medicine specialist and medical director of Clean Life Medical in Richmond.
Because addiction is a lethal disease. People die from it all the time. You meet some people who say they don't like the feeling of having opiates. Others like it, but there's a downside to it and only need to use it when they're in pain. But there will always be a certain percentage who are deeply impressed by the good feeling that opiates give them. Those people, if they're not careful, may find themselves pursuing that feeling.
And then what happens is they become addicted, and then if they end up not being able to get that medication, they'll turn to heroin, which is a cheaper form of the same type of substance.
Evan Barlow began experimenting with opiates in his teens, becoming completely addicted from age 16 to 20.
Eventually, pills weren't enough, and I eventually found heroin, then I eventually found the needle, which was my downfall.
So Jamie doesn't want to come over here?
Hannah Newsom's life was all late nights and parties when she began to abuse prescription pain pills. When those became harder to get, her friends began using heroin instead.
First, I was like, no. There is no way in the world that I'm gonna do that. And eventually, you know, pills weren't around and I was sick. So I tried it. I was maybe like 85 pounds, 90 pounds. My body was shutting down. I was sick all the time. No matter how much heroin I did, I was still sick. And then that was the start of the end.
My son is a heroin addict, and he is falling out, and I can't wake him up, and I don't know what's wrong with him.
As demand increases, some dealers may add other substances to make the heroin more appealing to users. One such substance is fentanyl, a powerful painkiller often prescribed to cancer patients. The intent is to create a more intense high, but it often leads instead to abrupt death.
I can't feel anything.
He's not breathing?
I can't feel anything coming out of his nose.
And fentanyl is a very strong painkiller, so it kind of like slows your heartbeat and your breathing down to almost nothing. With that on top of the heroin, people just expire because their heart stop beating and their lungs stop functioning.
And in Richmond, for example, the heroin was mixed with a horse tranquilizer. So heroin alone is deadly, but when you mix it with a substance like fentanyl, a painkiller, you don't stand a chance.
Some overdoses, if their friends and family react quick enough, they can be saved. But a lot of them, with the fentanyl cases, we're finding that even with quick reaction, they still passing away.
I think my friend just overdosed on heroin.
He's unconscious?
Yeah.
Still, despite warnings and news stories about the presence of dangerous additives, addicts in search of a bigger high are still willing to take the risk.
And unfortunately on the streets, if you have a heroin out there that overdoses and kills somebody, for some strange reason, more people want it.
People will be shocked by someone who dies of an overdose when I just see it and I'm like, well, it happened again, like, because it happens all the time.
Users who somehow avoid a fatal overdose are lucky not to face death, but they say what they're left with isn't much of a life.
I wasn't really living at all. I was dead inside. I was just walking around getting high every day. I had no purpose. I had no place on this planet to be anything. I was just a shell, and I would just use every day.
As their use of the drug increases, many don't realize the gravity of the situation until they begin to suffer the consequences of their dependency on the substance.
In other words, getting in trouble with the law, beginning to violate their own moral code, having to tell lies, having to hide their problem, having to steal from and deceive the people that they care about.
Everything in my life revolved around it. I didn't care about anything else. I stole from my family, from my friends, from stores, from anybody that had anything that the dope man would trade me for drugs.
With desperate users resorting to theft to pay for their habit, and ruthless sellers often using violence and gang activity to protect their profits, the heroin problem affects everyone in the Commonwealth.
And so we have an epidemic, and the epidemic has led to a lot of people whose lives have been ruined and to a lot of people who have died.
Too many Virginians are losing their loved ones to heroin and prescription drug overdoses. I don't want to see another parent bury a child, or another child to lose a parent to these dangerous drugs.
The problem is particularly evident in Hampton Roads, where the region's coastal location makes it particularly appealing to traffickers.
It's centralized. You can get drugs coming in from the ports, coming from Miami, and people from New York, people from out West Kentucky, West Virginia would come here to meet.
And we're on the Intercoastal Waterway, which goes from New York to Florida, and a lot of drug drop-offs are done at various spots throughout the ports.
And while a lot of that product is merely changing hands for distribution elsewhere, it is also contributing to a growing drug problem in Hampton Roads.
This heroin epidemic, just in this book alone, for the cases I've worked over the last 3 years, we're almost to more than 50 deaths that I've investigated myself just off of heroin.
The surge in heroin deaths caught the attention of the Virginia Attorney General's office, setting off an intense investigation in the region.
Prescription drug abuse often leads to a path of addiction and to the cheap and potent heroin that we're seeing on the streets today.
The deaths aren't limited to hardened, long-time drug users living in drug houses or back alleys.
You wouldn't imagine the areas that you get these drug overdoses at because they're not your typical ghetto, for example, neighborhood or your project complex neighborhood.
White females, black males, black females, Hispanics, it does not, whether you're rich, poor, or anything, it has no discrimination. This heroin, fentanyl epidemic is devastating all across the board.
I will never forget hearing a story from a woman I met coming off the public safety tour we did. She met me and she said she was so glad she got a chance to talk to me. And she told me that just a month earlier, she and her husband lost their daughter.
She was going to get well and be the mom that she knew she could be, because she hated the person who she'd become, because it wasn't her.
Happy birthday, dear Caitlin.
Caitlin Weems of Virginia Beach was outgoing, fun, and had a wide circle of friends. A competitive soccer player throughout middle and high school, she was certainly not predicted to become a heroin addict.
Caitlin was just a fun-loving girl. She liked to go out and smile and play sports, and she was really good at interacting and getting to know anybody and everybody.
She was very protective of the siblings and our family. If someone would mess with any of us, she would go right to them and take care of it.
Probably one of the best players that I have ever coached. I can really honestly say that. I've been doing this for over 20 years. Just really pleasant, great sense of humor. Just a joy to be around. Just loved her like a daughter.
After years of dedication to the sport, she developed a painful disc problem in her back. Then, in her freshman year of high school, she suffered a serious dental injury during the playoffs.
They wired her 3 teeth back in, but that led to 9 root canals after that and more pain, which led to more pain medicine.
The following year was a blur of dental surgeries and procedures, a time when Caitlin's mother says her time away from school led to loneliness. Looking back, that may have pushed her medication habit from therapeutic to problematic.
So I think that soon she got her tolerance, increased, and then it just wasn't working. So I would think that, by 11th grade, that she was dependent on it.
Caitlin kept her habit well hidden and eagerly went back to playing soccer.
This isn't one of Conley's soccer games.
She was recruited to play at a Pennsylvania college, but her college career had hardly begun when she met a young man who was also abusing prescription drugs.
So on her 12th day of college, she called me and said that she was leaving college and going to live with this boy out of state. And then that's when, I didn't know at the time, but a few months later, she was heavily addicted.
Now in Georgia, Caitlin was no longer getting her pills from doctor visits. She was buying everything from dealers and taking whatever she could get. For her family, the problem was now clear.
Several times I flew down there and begged her to come home. Her siblings begged her to come home to get help. And she came home probably about 6 or 7 times, but always went back.
Things started looking up when Caitlin found a new reason to get well. She was pregnant, and she wanted to come home to have the baby. Her family welcomed the idea, saying Caitlin could come home as long as she stuck to some strict ground rules.
So she agreed to that, and she stayed completely clean for 15 months and delivered the most beautiful, healthy baby.
Things went well until the baby was a few months old. Caitlin relapsed, and the following months were a series of rehab visits, good days and bad days, with no lasting success.
We as a family had to say, you're welcome to stay here as long as you're clean and sober, but if you're using drugs, you're not going to be able to stay here. So she actually moved out.
One day, Caitlin called to ask her mother if they could meet to talk. She needed to confess that since leaving home, her problem had reached a new level. She had moved on to heroin.
She said she had tried it, that somebody had told her that it's as good as pain medicine. It's basically the same thing. And so she said, so I need help because I can tell this drug is strong.
Again, Caitlin was off to rehab, but this time she agreed to move into a sober living facility afterward, something she had never agreed to before.
And she asked them to drug test her more often than usual because she was going to stay clean this time, and she wanted to show her parents and the judge that she was good to be a full-time mom now.
One night, she called home with some relatively minor troubles on her mind. Her mother told her to get a good night's sleep. She would see her the next day.
And that was like a 5-minute, conversation, and it was fine, and I was ready to pick her up the next day.
In the morning, Caitlin was nowhere to be found, but her roommates discovered that the bathroom door was locked.
So we got a screwdriver, and I unscrewed the doorknob, took the doorknob off, and I looked in the door, and that's when I saw her arm laying there blue. So at that point, we got a hammer and we all just started busting the door down. At that point, you didn't know what you were gonna walk into. So I walked in and there she was against the wall. She was dead already.
Detectives went to her parents' home to deliver the terrible news, just as Carolyn was gathering her things to go visit Caitlin.
From the moment that doorbell rang, I became a totally different person.